a lot of industries in the 20th century focused on scale and producing things in a large scale, a uniform product that they then push onto the market. And a lot of industries have realised that that no longer works and doesn't really produce what people want, and that there's much more of a focus on what the market's pulling from the producers rather than pushing onto them. It used to be that you could get a racer or a mountain bike and it was just one of those two, and now there are about sort of 20 different types of mountain bike you can get and 20 different kinds of road bike. And they've really realised that they're kind of, in other industries, that providing variety and trying to customise products to individual users is the way forward. In the housing industry, it seems like we're still back way in the 70s, where it's just like, well, everyone wants a house with a garage, 4 bedrooms, and it looks like a child's drawing of a house. And actually our experience as architects is people want much, much more from their housing, and people want a whole variety of things, and really the market should be catering for that. I think it's interesting to imagine a landscape where every house is built to kind of individually meet the needs of its occupiers. And I think this is how we used to live in the past. And for some reason, we've developed a kind of approach to housing that's much more about mass production and huge sort of estates that look the same wherever they're built. But I think it's really interesting, the government's actually really trying to encourage a smaller kind of grassroots self-build movement, where people actually, rather than buying a home off a developer, people buy a plot and then build a house themselves on that plot, which I think is really exciting. It's a real example of a bit of government legislation that's really looking at a grassroots movement rather than a top-down, how can we deal with this in one mass-produced solution. And you know, the big developers, they're great for quantity, but when it comes to kind of diversity, quality, and individual builds, that really isn't their strength. And yet I think that's what most people want from a home, is something that really meets their needs and is individual to them. I think it's a little bit like the craft beer movement. In the 90s you had sort of a few big brands who were all selling a very similar product. And then in the last 20 years or so there's been a real movement towards these sort of craft breweries and the craft beers. And actually a whole lot of small microbreweries have taken on these big international giants and actually produced something that's much more individual and characterful, and also created communities around their beer, because each brewery has a kind of a community. Often they have a kind of a pop-up pub in the brewery and things like that. And I think it could be really similar for housing, in that at the moment we've got a few big housing companies who are building about 90% of all of our housing. And I think it'd be really exciting if more of our housing started to be built by individuals from a grassroots perspective, and I think we'd get much more character and individuality in our homes. There's been recent legislation which came into force in 2016 that encourages every council to keep a register of the people who want to build their own home, and then they need to provide enough plots in order to meet the demand of that register. It's a little bit complicated in how it's kind of works, but the end result is really to encourage more self-build and custom-build housing, which is a great thing. And I think it's one of the few bits of legislation which really focuses on the small person rather than the sort of very large multinational companies. You know, change is difficult, but I think what's really exciting about the self-build legislation is it's a real invitation to small landowners, self-builders, small kind of construction companies to really think about a different way of doing housing, and that the government is there to support it if those kind of applications come forward. And there's a real opportunity here for planning departments to support self-build and the wonderful communities, innovation and creativity that comes out of people building their homes for themselves.